It has been a very busy week here, but I am prepared to share at least part of Chapter 7 of Cloak of Obscurity for anybody who'd care to listen. Chapter 7, A Pyre and a Penance. I found myself back on the beach of dead fish, watching Allison. She was not alone this time. Malcolm stood at her side, wringing his hands as she knelt sobbing over the lifeless body of her father. I wanted to approach them, talk to them, but suddenly I was accosted by a very large, very angry white duck. I woke up with a start, wondered groggily what of all I had eaten the previous day could have caused that mental aberration, and then dropped back off to sleep. Love you, Eddie. The next morning, I faced the challenge of finding something to wear to Allison's funeral. For a man with any pretensions of class, the clothes I'd worn earlier in the week were out of the question. Not only had they been filthy when I had peeled them off my body and flung them into a corner, but Silk, choosing them as her special target of her displeasure, had marked them as her own. Incidentally, if anyone ever tries to tell you that only tomcats do that, call him a liar. I opened my trunk. My options were limited. While I owned more clothes than some noblemen, most of them were tight-fitting button coats, bought in a fit of youthful exuberance when I'd first been admitted to the Wizards Guild. Shortly thereafter, I'd moved into the Snake and Egg, where Sadie had become her highly successful campaign to fatten me up. As fond as I'd been of my old wardrobe, I was fonder still of her cooking. I did have one fairly new black coat. It was rather snug, more so than I'd remembered, but I figured that if I avoided breakfast and deep breathing, it would stay buttoned. I gathered up the things I'd need to free Lee from his cell, promised Silk I wouldn't stay out too late, and went downstairs. "Oh, don't you look smart?" Sadie cooed. "Very handsome. That coat really shows off your figure." Thank you." I knew she meant it as a compliment. "You're leaving for the funeral already?" I nodded. "Nat and I will be leaving shortly. Are you going to see Lee on your way? I've got his breakfast ready. You can take it to him. Oh, I can get you something too, love." No, thanks. I'm in a hurry." "It's a pity Lee can't come to the funeral," Sadie said. "He'd be a great support to Dolores. And I know I'd love to see the little fella." After glancing about to be sure none of her morning customers were listening, I leaned over to put an arm around her shoulder. "Don't say anything, Sadie," I murmured, "but you just might get a glimpse of him, if you look carefully." Sadie hugged me. I could feel my buttons popping. "Oh, you're a wonder, Eddie. Here, take this to Lee and tell him we all miss him." I rebuttoned my coat and left, taking the basket with me. "Good morning, sleepyhead," I said to Lee, who was nestled in a small ball on his pallet. He uncurled, stretching and yawning. As he did so, I thought I saw a small section of shadow separate from his clothes. "Is there a rat in your bed?" I demanded. "What?" He wasn't quite awake. "Morning," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "What did you say? Is there what?" "A rat," I repeated. "I thought I saw a rat." "Do you want me to bring Silk in here?" "No, I'm fine." He blinked in the dim light. "How you can sleep here is beyond me," I said. "After being kept awake most of the night by the madman down the corridor, I'm not sure how I can wake up." "Nice coat. Is it new?" "Hardly." He squinted at me. I think a couple of your buttons are undone. I sighed and fastened them. Here, Sadie sent you breakfast. Eat up. I need to get you out of here quickly. You want some? He asked, opening the hamper. There's no way I'll eat all of this. I've been giving my leftovers to the jailer, telling him to share them out to the other prisoners, but I think he's keeping them himself. Not surprising, I said, rummaging through my bag. It was too dark to see what I was doing, so I took the risk of casting a light. Here, don't you want some of this? Lee repeated, offering part of a loaf. Oh, I'd like it, I admitted, but I'd like to keep my coat buttoned better. You just go ahead and eat it while I get things ready. I started sprinkling blue-green powder around the edges of the cell. Master Edward, Lee mumbled around a mouthful of bread, I've something to show you. I hid it under the straw. I knelt down to find it, popping half a dozen buttons as I did. I assumed it was more drawings, so I pulled out the sheet of parchment I found and gestured for my light to hover over my shoulder. Why, Lee, I said, this is incredible. It was a drawing of a young man who was wearing a short coat, hose, and boots. Lee had taken great pains to embellish the boots with ivy scrolls. The coat hung in soft folds and was cinched in with a belt of fine chains that, once again, Lee had rendered in great detail. As exquisitely drawn as the clothing was, however, it was the face that caught my eye. I could never say how he'd done it, but Lee had managed, in a few lines at the corners of the eyes, or perhaps in the angle of the mouth, to give the impression that the figure was about to start laughing. Lee, I said, still staring at the parchment, this can't be... This isn't supposed to be me, is it? Lee's face fell. You don't like it? No, I said, I do like it. It's supposed to be me. Of course it's supposed to be you, Lee said, but it must be awful if you keep asking me that. I'm sorry, I'll scrape it off. No, I said, it's not awful, it's too good. I mean, I don't look like this. I'm much fatter, and I'm nowhere near as handsome, and... Whatever you say, Master Edward, if you say so. I thought it looked exactly like you, but if you don't agree, I guess it doesn't. Aren't you supposed to be doing some sort of spell anyway? Yes, I said. Can I keep this drawing? Do whatever you want with it. I don't care. I realized I'd hurt his feelings. Lee, I began, I want to show this to my grandfather. I told you about him. He owns a city scriptorium. He hires artists. But it doesn't look like you, said Lee petulantly. He had curled up again. His knees were drawn to his chest and his arms were wrapped around his legs. It looks better than I do, I said. Lee snorted. You know, if all a person had to go on was what you say about yourself, they'd figure you were a fat, warty lump of an ogre, so hideous that the light of day would refuse to shine on you. And they'd think you were so poor you lived in a fish barrel, and so weak in magic you couldn't make water, much less water into wine. I laughed so hard that a button burst on my coat and shot across the cell. Lee, I said, now, see what you've done to me? Where'd that blasted button go? Here it is, said Lee, retrieving it. Master Edward, I don't mean to insult you, but I do think you'd find people would respect you more if you showed more respect for yourself. I raised an eyebrow at his words. He was starting to sound like my father. You show remarkable wisdom for someone your age, I said. Now, about getting you out of here. Put on this cloak. As I put out my light, Lee draped the shimmering gray fabric over his shoulders and faded back against the stones of the wall. Even looking straight at him, he was hard to see. A movement against the stones, a flicker of light where his eyes were. "No offense," came a voice from the shimmer, "but this thing's huge. I'm lost in it." It was easier to find him by touching him. I reached out to help him arrange the fabric. "Well, I know it's too long," I said. "Just hold it up like this." I draped the excess over his arms. "Now, what does this do? Make me invisible?" he asked. "No, not invisible exactly," I said. "Just hard to see. Less noticeable. Everyone expects you to be in here and not out there. So unless you do something to draw attention to yourself, no one will notice you. The spell I put on this cloak works on the principle that people tend to see what they expect to see." I saw a shift in the shadows I assumed was a nod. "Oh, I understand that," Lee said. "Trust me, people hardly notice me even when I'm not in this cloak." "Well, then we should have no trouble at all. You'll need to stay as quiet as you can, of course, and try to keep out of the light. Follow behind me." I moved to the door. "How are we going to get out without the jailer?" Locks have never been a problem for me." Standing in the corridor, I motioned Lee up against the wall. He faded into the stonework while I locked the door and completed the spell to convince the jailer that the boy was still inside the cell. "Stay," I whispered through the lock. "Stay until I say go." I placed a bit more of the blue powder in the keyhole. Not a moment too soon either, as the jailer came down the hall, jingling his keys. "Hey, how'd you get out here?" he demanded. "I let myself out," I said in a tone that implied I had every right to do so. "My father once told me that a good part of success is acting as if you both know what you're doing and have the right to do it. I locked the door behind me, don't worry." The jailer rattled the lock to be certain, peeked in the window, grumped approval, and led me out of the jail. I resisted the temptation to look over my shoulder for Lee until I was well away from the prison and had turned up a side street where the light was filtered by trees from someone's walled garden. I turned to address a heavier patch of dimpled shadow. "Are you all right?" Lee pushed the hood back, and the shadows resolved themselves into his face, his hands, and the rough suggestion of a draped body. "Of course I'm all right," he said. "Why do you ask?" I shrugged. "Honestly, I wasn't sure you were following me." "Whew, you were so quiet." He grinned. "Had you worried, huh? Say, why didn't the jailer notice I was gone when he looked in the cell?" "Because he saw you curled up in the straw asleep. I placed an illusion on the cell. It'll stay there until the door's opened, or I take it off." "Can I see it when we get back?" "Sure, but now we need to get going. They just rang the third bell. The funeral should be soon." I started walking towards the temple. "Go ahead and leave your hood down," I told Lee. "People will see you like that, but they won't recognize you or really notice you unless they're looking hard for you." "All right," he said, moving it a step beside me. He made a face. "You suppose you could figure out how to do this spell without the cloak someday? I'm stifling." "I'll see what I can do," I said. "I'm not exactly thrilled to be wearing black in this weather myself." "Say, I forgot to ask," Lee said as we walked. "Did you have any more interesting dreams last night?" As a matter of fact, yes. I was attacked by an angry duck." "Huh." Lee laughed. "Was duck on Sadie's menu last night?" "No, if I'd dreamt of her cooking, I'd have been attacked by mushrooms," I said. "I have no idea where the duck came from." "Allison owned a duck," said Lee. "That's right," I said. "Dolores told me that. And she said it's been acting sick, too." "Oh, That's a shame, said Lee. He's a nice duck. I like him. What else did you dream about? Well, let's see. Allison was there and Malcolm. And they were mourning over the body of her father. And then the duck attacked and I woke up. Oh, and the dead fish were still there too. Had you eaten any fish? Lee asked. No, not last night. Well, then perhaps they do mean something, he said reasonably. Perhaps something to do with Allison having drowned, or maybe we'll find her ring inside a fish. Does that ever really happen, Master Edward? I shrugged. Some fish will snap at any shiny object moving through the water. That's why folk use bits of polished metal as lures. But I don't relish the thought of searching through the entrails of every fish in the market, trying to find a ring. You could offer a reward, Lee suggested. Then other people would search. A reward of what? I said. Sadie and Nat spent all their money to bribe that prison guard, and you know I haven't any either. The boy was undaunted. Sadie could make a huge fish fry, he suggested. She could make money. We could look for the ring. Folks could get a good meal. Well, I thought it was a good idea, he protested as I started chuckling. Well, it does have its advantages as a plan, I admitted. Though if Sadie were cooking that many fish, I know I'd be press-ganged into kitchen work. And what's wrong with that? Obviously, you've never spent 12 hours crammed into a hot, crowded kitchen with half a dozen sweaty cooks, trying to dodge stray knives, scalding hot lard spatters, and, oh yeah, the occasional fish head. Can't say that I have, Lee admitted. Before we arrived at the temple gates, I told Lee to pull his hood back up, and he reminded me to check my buttons. Like the service for her father, Allison's funeral was held in the chapel of Saint Morgana. There was a large crowd of people, some straying over from the God's Day services, others just arriving from the streets. One would like to think it was because the girl had been well loved by her neighbors. But from the smattering of conversations I overheard, I think that most of the people were there to gossip about the poor girl's death. Malcolm was there, stony-faced and silent, standing next to Dolores, who was weeping into her sleeve. Nat and Sadie were standing nearby. Sadie caught sight of me and began pushing her way towards me through the crowd. I think she was trying to be subtle, but considering her size and the fact that she had dressed for the occasion by trussing herself into a remarkably tight gown, she was about as inconspicuous as a warship in a duck pond. She maneuvered up to my side. "Eddie, love," she hissed. I glanced down at her. She had put on clean veils, one to wrap her hair and one to cover her throat and breast. The lower veil had slipped, displaying an imposing expanse of bosom. "Look, Eddie," she continued. "See that man over there?" She indicated someone standing near Malcolm. He was about 50, balding, with some gray hair, medium height, a bit heavy. He was wearing a somber gray coat and loose hose, and was most noticeable because, unlike most of the people present, he looked like he was there for a funeral rather than a play. "Do you see him?" she continued. "Yes." "That's Arnold, the cobbler," she said, "the fellow who owns the shop next door to the tanner's. It's his son Dennis that was betrothed to Allison. And it's his son who's been missing ever since Allison disappeared." She fairly quivered with excitement as she passed along this news. "Shh," I warned, fearful that people could overhear us. "Missing?" "Yes," she said, nodding with such enthusiasm her breast bobbled. I averted my eyes. "Heard it from Dolores, who heard it from Cobbler's cook. The old man's not telling anyone. He's let on his son's sick. But the boy's not been home." "Shh," I repeated vainly. "He's the killer for sure," Sadie hissed. "Possibly," I whispered, "or perhaps he's a victim as well." At this point, I was more concerned with Lee. "Sadie, please, let Dolores know. I want to talk to her after the service. Meet me at the graveyard." "Of course, Eddie," she said, and elbowed her way back through the crowd to her husband. I was fairly sure that everyone around us had heard our conversation. Certainly within a few minutes, during which the crowd seethed like boiling noodles, everyone present was staring at old Cobbler. He was sure to have noticed, but continued looking straight ahead with stony dignity. I wondered if he might have killed Allison himself for breaking her betrothal to his son. Better focus on one suspect at a time, I told myself. Allison's ceremony was shorter than her father's had been. Once the chanting was over, and the priest had carried her bier out to the cart, waiting to take it to the graveyard, the crowd vanished. The show was over, and the morbidly curious were compelled to return to work, bearing the latest gossip, of course. By nightfall, the whole city would know the cobbler's son had been accused. Only Malcolm, Dolores, Sadie, and myself, followed silently by Lee, made the long walk to the north gate and the guildsman's section of the cemetery. There, with a few simple words, Allison was placed on her funeral pyre. Once the flames died out, her ashes would be returned to the soil from which St. Dana had formed us, buried in a tiny plot alongside those of her father. Her immortal soul had long since been returned to God. I recognized the priestess who spoke the words of farewell. It was Mother Lillian. I resolved to speak with her. I owed her a penance, and the sooner I got that over with, the better. First, however, I needed to speak to Dolores. Before I could approach her, Malcolm stood up to me. "I can't believe you dare to show your face here," he said. I wondered if my face was about to receive another beating. Holy ground was not known to deter Malcolm. "Everything I have done," I said softly, "has been to find the truth about what happened to Allison." "What's happened to her is she's dead," he said bitterly. "Nothing can help that. You've cleared your mongrel friend, wizard, and that's all you really wanted. Now why don't you go home to your damn spells and leave us alone?" "Allison's death is still a mystery," I began, "and if the king's men wanted your help in solving it, they would ask you. It's their job to seek justice in this city, not yours." I shook my head. "I've started this road," I said. "I mean to finish it." "Phew, no matter where it may lead you, then may you take joy in your journey." He snorted and stalked off. "Please," said Dolores, moving to my side, "forgive him. He's been near mad with grief since Allison was found. I can't see how he's going to keep the shop open." She was still crying. "Oh, bear up, Dolly," encouraged Sadie, hugging her friend to her bosom. "You'll be all right. You know you've got a place with me if you need it. Yeah, and you've got me too, declared Lee, startling the two women by seeming to materialize out of a clump of cedar trees. Gracious, screamed Dolores. Flesh and blood, cried Sadie, but you gave me a turn. Lee laughed and tossed me the cloak before hugging the women. How did you get here? Dolores asked. Master Edward, of course, Lee said, bowing to me as if I'd done a great service. I shrugged. Nothing to it. I just used some simple theater tricks. Now, if you don't mind, I said, tossing the cloak back to Lee, I have to speak to the priestess for a few minutes.